Black women in the mid-19th century, life for them was extremely difficult. The majority of Black women were actually in bondage at that point. Black women were not women for all intents and purposes, so they had no rights to protection. They had no control over their lives or the lives of their progeny. So if they gave birth to children, they became the property, essentially, of the owners.
It was a very dangerous time to be a person of color. There were no anti-lynching laws. There was anti-lynching activism, but no laws. And there were less restrictions on the violence that was perpetrated upon people of color.
This is such a difficult period. After the end of Reconstruction, Black women are facing, along with men, the most horrific period we've ever seen of murders and lynchings and burnings and destruction of African American people.
Black women had to fight to protect their brothers, their husbands, their sons, and indeed themselves from being lynched by whites who did not advocate or support or want to see Black self-determination, which meant freedom, access to all the rights and privileges of citizenship in the United States.
Southern states realized that they can begin to limit voting rights and every other right for African Americans in the South in any way possible. The 15th Amendment only says that there shall be no restriction on suffrage based on race or previous condition of servitude. So they can exclude people from voting, including by grandfather clauses, literacy clauses, poll taxes, which they do.
At the time, Black women were very active in not only the suffragist movement, but it was the voting movement, period, trying to make sure that Black men and women, Black people, were given the responsibility, the honor, the privilege of voting.
It would have been a luxury to just concentrate on getting the right to vote. So most did not exclusively focus on women's suffrage, but suffrage was always important to women of color, and they pushed their husbands to vote, even though it was dangerous to go to the polls in many parts of the United States. They pushed it.
They did actually organize. There were clubs which they had established to seek justice for African Americans. They were abolitionists, they were suffragists. These women, too, understood that the vote would allow them to affect change, but they had to look at sex, they had to look at class, they had to look at race, because they experienced those issues in ways that were different. They didn't have the protection of the law or of policies or practices for that matter. So they were discouraged in some instances from participating in the larger movement because they were perceived as fighting for race issues and not so-called feminist issues.
We were not given the recognition for what we were doing, and many Black women suffered the same prejudice, the same racism in trying to support that movement as we did in our lives, everyday lives.
We got the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, but for all intents and purposes, African Americans didn't get the right to vote, men or women, until the Voter Rights Act of 1965. And what we've seen subsequently are measures to undercut that bill. And we still see it's being under assault as we sit here and talk today.
History is written by the people in power. It's not in history books because we were not the people in power. Women weren't in power at that time. Black people were not in power. So the stories remain hidden unless you're researching it. I think what today's young woman, black, white, yellow, or red, needs to learn is that women need to stand up for women. We need to understand that while it may look like we have all the rights on paper, No, we don't. We still are struggling with the basics, being paid equally, having access to the same jobs. We are still knocking our heads up against this strange glass ceiling. And although there are a few women that sit at boards, we still don't have enough there. I think when women today, young girls, understand that they are empowered to do anything they choose to, then we'll be on the right path.